Good afternoon. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit regarding the reauthorization of the CFTC as it relates to end users will come to order. And before we get started, I'd like to just make a brief comment that we have votes coming somewhere around 1:30. If the vote is called, we'll break long enough to have that and come back for questions after that. So good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural hearing of the Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit Subcommittee of the House Agriculture Committee. I'm honored that Chairman Conaway has asked me to serve the committee in this Congress by chairing our newest subcommittee. When Mr. Conaway asked me to step into this role, he said that he wanted to ensure that the committee never lost sight of the importance of derivatives markets, not only to our traditional agricultural firms, but also to the wider economy. Today's hearing will examine the reauthorization of the CFTC and the challenges end users are facing as they use these markets to manage the risk of doing business in a global marketplace. We're fortunate to be joined today by a panel of distinguished witnesses, each of whom has a unique perspective of the challenges facing the end users of derivatives. We look forward to hearing their thoughts on these issues that the committee should be considering during the reauthorization process. Last week, Chairman Conaway laid out 3 principles for guiding the committee's work. Derivative markets exist to meet the needs of hedgers. Regulatory requirements should be both minimized and justified, and regulations should provide clarity and certainty. These principles, along with the goal to balance access with integrity, will frame our discussions today as we hear from our witnesses. Over the past 2 Congresses, this committee has heard from dozens of witnesses who have shared with us the difficulties that they have had understanding and complying with the flurry of rulemaking issued because of the Dodd-Frank Act. As I've listened to them, 2 things have become clear. First, no witness has called for repeal of Title VII. In fact, most witnesses have supported the goals of Title VII. But my second point is the process of planning, drafting, and enacting the rules could be at best called troubling. Today's task is to look back at the process of the past 5 years and to examine the places where this committee can take action. We won't be repealing Dodd-Frank, and we won't be working to weaken its market-wide protections of Title VII. But we will be looking to see where our actions can clarify congressional intent, minimize regulatory burdens, and most importantly, preserve the ability for these necessary risk management markets to serve the American farmers, ranchers, and businesses. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before us today. I know many of you traveled to be here and worked hard to prepare your remarks over the past week. I appreciate your time and efforts, and with that, I'll turn to our ranking member and my fellow Georgian, Representative David Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I really appreciate that. As the Democratic ranking member, I'm looking forward to working with you and the committee as we continue our critical mission to reauthorize the Commodities Exchange Act. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased that, as you know, in the last Congress, we put together a very good bipartisan package, H.R. 4413, the Customer Protection End User Relief Act, which was good common sense legislation that was passed in this committee by a voice vote. It was passed on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, but unfortunately was not voted on in last year's Senate. So this year we need new legislation which mirrors H.R. 4413. And an essential component of H.R. 4413 was its ability to provide much needed clarity and relief to end users, which are our agriculture and energy producers, who actually use the derivatives market to hedge against risk, and they did not cause the financial collapse. Most specifically, we need legislation that will do the following: allow end users who are legitimate commercial market participants to avoid being inadvertently classified as financial entities because of their commercial activities. Additionally, we need language that provides alternative record-keeping requirement to grain elevators, farmers, agriculture counterparties, and commercial market participants, instead of these entities having to meet the same record-keeping rules as swap dealers. Furthermore, we must allow for a delay in real-time swap reporting for non-financial end users whose swap activity can be identifiable in thinly traded markets in order to prevent them from being competitively disadvantaged by financial players. And finally, we must require a vote by the CFTC before the swap dealer de minimis level automatically changes from the current level of $8 billion, which was established by the CFTC in regulations. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, let me emphasize Congress never intended for the end users to be regulated in the same manner as financial entities. And I hope that we can continue our bipartisan work in this committee to yet again produce common sense bipartisan legislation that will do exactly that. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman Scott. Mr. Conaway.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I just want to, on this inaugural hearing for the your David's subcommittee, just express my confidence in both of you. I've worked with David as the ranking member. He and I shared this responsibility for 4 years. I've got great confidence in him. And Austin, based on your professional background, I know you bring a wealth of talent to the table to make this happen. And you're motivated with the birth of a new daughter, Carmen Gabriella Scott.
Absolutely.
On the ground, I guess, last week. Mother and daughter doing fine?
They are doing very well. Thank you very much.
So thank the panel for being here today. We've got some important things to do. I, too, like David, intend to get a bipartisan bill out with respect to the reauthorization. We did it last time and have no intentions to do anything but have the bill come out that would be bipartisan. Your hearings this week, Austin, will be an important part of our reconsideration of the legislation that was passed, and I'm looking forward to Scott Cousins making this thing work. So look forward to great confidence in both of you being from Georgia. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Peterson. The Chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the witnesses may begin their testimony and ensure that there is ample time for questions. The Chair would like to remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority for members who were present at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of their arrival. I appreciate your understanding of this. Witnesses are reminded to limit their oral presentation to 5 minutes. All of your written statements will be included for the record. Our witnesses with panel 1, I'd like to welcome you to the Ag Committee in Washington. Mr. Douglas Christie is president of Cargill Cotton, Cordova, Tennessee, and he's here on behalf of the Commodity Markets Council. Mr. Lael E. Campbell, Director of Regulatory and Government Affairs, Constellation Exelon Company, Washington, D.C., on behalf of the Edison Electric Institute. Ms. Lisa Cavallari, Director of Fixed Income Derivatives, Russell Investments, Seattle, Washington, on behalf of the American Benefits Council. Mr. Mark Maurer, Chief Executive Officer, INTL FCS Stone, Markets LLC, Chicago, Illinois. And Mr. Howard Peterson, President and owner of Peterson Oil, Worcester, Massachusetts, on behalf of the New England Fuel Institute. Mr. Christie, please begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Scott, for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Commodity Markets Council. The CMC...
Excuse me, could you move the mic a little closer?
The CMC appreciates the opportunity to present our views on the reauthorization of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. As you consider reauthorization, we would like to point out that the CFTC's multi-year effort to implement new swap regulatory rules has morphed into an effort to rewrite long-standing futures market regulations that Congress, via Dodd-Frank, never contemplated. These regulations are being proposed without consideration of the real impact on commodity producers or consumers. The additional regulatory impact that these actions would force upon end users and commercial participants will ultimately be passed on as the effects work their way through the supply chain. These actions will also impact market liquidity, which will further raise the costs of risk management and ultimately reduce the pricing efficiency across the supply chain of finished agricultural and energy goods. These actions will result in a higher cost risk management and more imperfect risk management. Orderly and established risk management practices that commercial end users have used in the past could now be curtailed or require exemptions. This would result in more volatility, less price discovery, and more uncertainty for producers and consumers. This outcome was not intended when swap reform was initially contemplated. Let me illustrate. The current proposed position limits rule intends to curtail excessive speculation by placing limits on the size of positions that any entity can accumulate across 28 different commodities. As has been the case for decades for commercial entities that manage risk, such as flour mills, refineries, grain elevators or exporters, or cotton shippers, the rule allows an exemption to these limits if the commercial firm has a bona fide reason for doing so. Unfortunately, the CFTC's proposed rule narrows the definition of bona fide hedges to such a degree that established risk management practices may now be excluded from the definition. The CMC and many industry groups, from agricultural to energy companies, have provided many detailed examples to the CFTC in public filings and at many of the public forums the CFTC has held to discuss the position limits rule. These examples are too numerous to recount in detail in this oral testimony. They include, but are not limited to, merchandising, anticipatory and processing hedges, irrevocable bids and offers, as well as cross hedges, gross and net hedging. These give market participants the ability to hedge not only price risk, but risk associated with time, location and delivery, or product quality, form, specifications, or individual components of a commodity. The CFT should limit excessive speculation by focusing the rule on the actions of excessive speculators, not by limiting the ability of commercial end users to engage in commercially and economically appropriate, risk-mitigating, bona fide transactions for which these markets are intended. Congress can help by urging the CFTC to adopt a final rule that reflects the needs of end users and by further clarifying the definition of bona fide hedge. Amendments to Regulation 1.35 have created an unpredictable and onerous burden for firms in the cash business. An effort to bring swaps under a regulation that covered previously existing rules on floor traders has resulted in firms that engage in cash transactions having to keep more information about their conversations if the conversation could lead to a derivatives transaction. Identifying which of often multiple conversations or texts or emails ultimately lead to a derivatives transaction is hard to discern. Thus, the rule will force members to spend significant amounts of time and resources in a commercially impractical attempt to capture all required records, limiting the ability of commercial firms to utilize modern and efficient means of communication. The CFTC has recognized the difficulty and attempted to modify the rule. Despite the CFTC's efforts, the uncertainty continues. CMC members believe the proposed changes do not go far enough in providing relief. At an extreme, some may consider withdrawing from membership in DCMs and CEFs, which would reduce transparency in the marketplace and lead to legal and regulatory uncertainty for end users and customers. The CMC has additional priorities that are included in my written testimony. These include the importance of updating deliverable supply estimates, ensuring trade options are not subject to position limits, position aggregation, and swap dealer de minimis levels. I appreciate your consideration of all the views in the CMC oral and written testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the views of end users in reauthorizing the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I'm Will Campbell, Director of Regulatory Affairs with Exelon Corporation, testifying on behalf of the Edison Electric Institute, EEI. EEI is the Association of U.S. investor-owned electric utilities, whose members serve nearly 70% of America's industries, businesses, and consumers with their electricity. EEI members are the quintessential commercial end users. The goal of EEI member companies is to provide their consumers with reliable electric service at affordable and stable rates. And the derivatives markets are a critical tool for insulating our customers from energy price risk. As end users, we support the Dodd-Frank Act's primary goals of mitigating risk to the financial system and increasing transparency in the derivatives markets. However, there are areas where Congress should consider minor adjustments to ensure that Dodd-Frank achieves its purpose while not impeding our ability to hedge and manage risks associated with our core business of producing and delivering physical energy to our customers. I would like to highlight three of these concerns: the treatment of physical contracts with volumetric optionality, the de minimis threshold, and the definition of bona fide hedging. One of the key concerns for end users is an interpretation of the definition of a swap that includes options for physical delivery, as well as physically settled forward transactions with embedded optionality. These are physically settled contracts that are entered into solely between physical market participants, and serve the purpose of providing flexibility to respond to changing supply and demand circumstances, such as ensuring delivery of fuel to a generation plant when that fuel is needed. Treating these everyday physically delivered transactions that are used to manage operational and physical supply risk as swaps has significantly and unnecessarily increased end-user compliance costs with no recognizable offsetting public benefit. If a transaction at inception is intended for physical settlement, the transaction should be excluded from the term swap. Another important issue for end users is the automatic drop of the de minimis threshold for registration with the CFTC as a swap dealer. The CFTC set this de minimis threshold at $8 billion. However, the de minimis threshold is scheduled to be reduced automatically to $3 billion at the end of 2017 without any stakeholder process. End users are concerned that a lower swap dealer de minimis threshold will cause companies to cease transacting in swaps with other end users, leading to fewer hedging counterparties available in the market, making hedging and risk management all the more difficult and costly. Notably, we have already experienced the negative impact of an unreasonably low de minimis threshold. When the CFTC initially proposed a lower swap dealing threshold for counterparties of municipal utilities, those utilities found that the number of available counterparties diminished significantly, essentially leaving only the large banks to transact with. This experience highlights the important role the end-user-to-end-user swap market plays in managing risk in the energy space, and shows that a lower de minimis level will likely result in decreased market liquidity and, in turn, increase risk, increased cost to hedgers, and ultimately increased cost to consumers. The final issue I would like to discuss is the proposed narrowing of what constitutes a bona fide hedge. The dynamic and complex nature of energy markets, in particular electricity markets, demands flexibility to those charged with managing risk in these markets. EEI is concerned that the CFTC's proposed position limit rule unduly precludes long-established and well-accepted hedging practices. Although EEI has a number of concerns in the area of position limits, I would like to highlight the proposed limitation on the ability to engage in cross-commodity hedging. For example, using a natural gas derivative to hedge electricity price risk. Under the proposed rule, the CFTC would only presume bona fide hedging status for a cross-commodity hedge if it meets a rigid mathematical correlation. This quantitative requirement ignores the undeniable relationship between the price of electricity and the price of the fuels used to generate electricity, as well as the long-standing and accepted risk management practice of power generators and power suppliers to use fuel-based derivatives to hedge electricity price risk. Deference must be given to long-established and widely recognized risk management practices of end users, such as cross-commodity hedging. A narrowing of the bona fide hedging definition that ignores these industry-accepted practices will stifle market liquidity, negatively impact price transparency, and increase hedging costs. These costs ultimately will be reflected in the prices consumers pay for energy. In conclusion, I would like to thank the committee for helping to ensure that EEI members continue to use derivatives to protect our companies and their consumers from energy price risk. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Cavallari.
Good afternoon, Chairman Conaway and Scott, and ranking members Peterson and Scott. I am Lisa Cavallari, Director of Fixed Income Derivatives at Russell Investments. Russell Investments is a global financial services firm and provides consulting, asset management, trading implementation, and index services. We provide these services as a fiduciary for our clients and an agent of our clients, which means that we act exclusively on their behalf. The overwhelming majority of our clients are pension plans. Russell is also a member of the board of directors of and works closely with the American Benefits Council, whose mission, like ours, is dedicated to the advocacy of employer-sponsored benefit plans. The Council is a public policy organization representing principally Fortune 500 companies and other organizations that assist employers of all sizes. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak to this subcommittee and share my ideas and ways about which we can collectively continue the good work that Congress and the CFTC has chosen to achieve its ambitious goals set about by the G20. First, I'd like to discuss how pension plans and end users of the swaps use particularly bilateral, cleared, and futures markets. Then I'd like to discuss some very real-life costs that our pension plan users are facing and some of the challenges that we've had to face these last couple of years. Pension plans use swaps for a range of risk-reducing activities, in part because they are a cost-effective way of obtaining and eliminating specific exposures quickly. An example of risk reduction is the use of interest rate hedging by pension plans. Interest rate swaps, both cleared and uncleared, are an effective hedge against any potential volatile interest rate movements. If a plan has $5 billion in assets and $5 billion in liabilities today, everything is balanced. However, if interest rate swaps decline, this impacts the liability side of the equation, and it could create a funding shortfall. Depending upon the severity of the shortfall, under the worst circumstances, it could serve to strain the employer's balance sheet and give rise to solvency risk. Under the more likely scenario, however, is that it will require the employer to divert resources away from efforts that lead to economic expansion. This shortfall can be cost-effectively eliminated by employing interest rate swaps. Even in this low interest rate environment that we are experiencing today, interest rate swap instruments can meaningfully reduce the volatility of the funded status of a plan. This is a powerful risk mitigant that we need to ensure can continue to be accessible by plans. I'd like to discuss briefly some of the costs that our end users are now facing in a very real-life and dramatic example. A pension plan client of Russell's, one that is active in the futures, cleared swaps, and bilateral swaps worlds, is facing significantly rising costs. Russell is an agent and fiduciary and investment advisor for this pension plan that trades billions of dollars. On an annualized basis, their costs were, at the end of 2014, about $25,000, again, annualized, for billions of dollars in positions. The FCM, a clearing member, who acts as an agent on our client's behalf, has recently raised their fee schedule to over $560,000 annually. They have cited a combination of Title VII regulations that conspired with the Basel III capital ratios that these swap dealers need to maintain. Together, these forces have conspired to increase the cost of these pension plans, and we have no doubt that that will continue. Some of the factors that contribute to these increasing costs are ideas of netting in regards particularly to pension plans, and also the posting of initial margin. Though complicated in nature and multifaceted, we look forward to working with different regulators, Prudential and as well as the CFTC, to overcome these obstacles. A conservative pension plan client base is important, as well as other members of this panel, in terms of the constituencies for the liquidity that they provide the swaps market. This is a very important detail. As a side note, the initial margin, which traditionally pension plans have not posted in the bilateral markets, could be imposed if proposed rules are set in place. This is, again, something that we would challenge, as the end user of a derivative is a very conservative pension plan. Some of these forces have conspired to increase costs, as I used in my example. We welcome the opportunity, and we've seen, certainly with Commissioner Giancarlo's white paper on CEFs, we welcome the opportunity and have worked closely with the CFTC and staff to make tweaks around the margin for the different rules that have been put in place as a result of Title VII. Again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to just outline a few of the issues which are very pertinent to the pension plan community and the end users that I represent. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Scott, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the time, and it's an honor being here. My name is Mark Maurer. I am from the state of Kansas and moved to Chicago about 13 years ago. My background is primarily in the risk management side, but I also have experience in operations and trading. I work for INTLFC Stone Markets, which is a subsidiary of INTLFC Stone, Inc., a publicly traded company listed on the NASDAQ. I'll refer to INTLFC Stone Markets as IFM for the rest of this testimony. We were the first non-bank swap dealer to register with the CFTC, and our business is built on servicing the commercial end user, our customer, offering them the ability to hedge their commodity exposures. Who are these customers? We are talking about the soybean co-ops in Illinois. We are talking about the corn co-ops in Iowa. We are talking about the cattle ranchers in Texas. The majority of our business is helping the farmers of America hedge their commodity exposures. The markets we are discussing today were built for the end users. That's why they are in existence. Today we are here to discuss a few different proposals from the CFTC that were intended to prevent systemic risk in our industry. We believe we are in a stable and growing industry when it comes to the farmers of America and their ability to hedge their commodity-based risk. But if these rules are finalized as proposed, our customers will either lose their ability to hedge, as they had in the past, or their hedging costs will be much greater. First, I will talk about the CFTC's proposed margin rules. One of the reasons we are currently able to give our customers great pricing is because we are able to use the margin delivered by customers to finance the offsetting hedge to support the customer's trade. Without these offsetting hedges, we would be adding systemic risk to the industry. We believe our customers should have the ability to choose whether their margin should be used in this manner. Last year, we offered our customers the choice as to whether to instead hold their margin in a segregated account. Not one of our customers made the selection, as the costs of using segregated accounts were, in their view, unnecessary. But the CFTC's proposed rule would have required holding these funds in separate accounts. Under the proposed rule, not only the cost of setting up the margin accounts, but also the costs of the offsetting hedge will have to be passed on to the customers, which will make it less appealing for them to hedge and therefore add systemic risk to the industry. Now let's talk about the CFTC's proposed swap dealer capital rule. We are 100% in favor of having a fair capital requirement that applies to all swap dealers, both banks and non-banks. In Chairman Conaway's remarks at the recent Futures Industry Association conference, he said that regulatory burdens should be both minimalized and justified. What does this proposed capital rule mean for our customers? Our customers continually think about price risk, basis risk, volatility risk, and credit risk, but they also are affected by regulatory risk. We appreciate the acknowledgement, as was included in the committee's bipartisan CFTC reauthorization bill of the last Congress, that the CFTC's proposed rule for non-banks versus banks were not fair and needed to be addressed. For example, a position that a bank swap dealer has on that requires a capital usage of $10 million would require a non-bank swap dealer to have upwards of $1 billion of regulatory capital set aside. This large difference will significantly impact the regulatory risk incurred by our customers. Why is there such a large difference? Under the CFTC's proposed rule, bank-affiliated swap dealers are allowed to use their own internal models to calculate their capital requirements, but non-bank swap dealers are not permitted to use internal models in the same way. Non-bank swap dealers must calculate their capital based on a formula created by the CFTC. This formula does not permit netting except for identical offsetting positions. For example, if IFM has a short 10,000 March swap corn position and a 10,000 long swap position in May contrast, this would constitute a 20,000 gross exposure and there would be no netting. But as all of us know, a March-May spread is actually less risky than an outright March or an outright May contract. Coming up with a solution that is fair for non-bank and bank swap dealers is in the best interest of our industry and our customers. And remember, our mid-market customer base may not have a wide range of solutions that larger players in these markets have. But these customers are our core client base. If a solution is not found to make these capital rules equitable, our customer base and the farmers of America may lose many of their competitive choices to hedge. In closing, thank you for your time. I'd like to reiterate that we are currently in a stable, growing industry that allows us to manage risk for our farmers in America. We, as a group, need to come up with a solution to keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee. As the owner and president of a small Main Street business, I thank you for the opportunity to provide my perspective on the CFTC reauthorization. My company, Peterson Soil Service, is a fourth-generation, family-owned and operated business that has served the home heating needs of central Massachusetts since 1946. Our company sells bioheat fuel, a blend of biodiesel and low-sulfur heating oil produced by local biodiesel manufacturing plants from waste vegetable oil. This blend burns cleaner and more efficiently and has a lower carbon footprint than natural gas. I am testifying as past chairman of New England Fuel Institute and as a director of the Petroleum Marketers Association of America. Together, these associations represent marketers who serve more than 8 million bioheated fuel households and home and distribute to over 100,000 convenience stores and gasoline stations. These businesses, including my own, rely on functional commodity, futures, options, and swap markets as a hedging and price discovery tool in order to minimize the exposure to price volatility and to provide our customers with the most affordable products possible. We urge the Congress to fully fund the CFTC at the amount requested for fiscal year 2016. The importance of funding the CFTC cannot be overstated, especially given its mission to protect businesses like mine from fraud, manipulation, and wild price springs that can result from excessive speculation and disruptive trading practices. The CFTC is the cop on the beat and needs adequate resources to oversee constantly these evolving markets. In the 4 years leading up to the passage of Dodd-Frank, this committee and others in Congress held countless hearings on the causes of the 2008 crisis that created unprecedented volatility in energy and other commodities. During these hearings, businesses like mine joined in bipartisan support with other industries and called upon Congress to bring greater transparency, accountability, and oversight to the commodity markets. Since then, these markets have become even larger, and the need for oversight is even greater. Congress did 3 important things. First, through Dodd-Frank, it improved the transparency and market oversight to further protect end users against fraud and manipulation. Second, Congress strengthened the CFTC's ability to police and prosecute market manipulation. Penalties imposed by the CFTC have increased from $100 million in 2009 to $1.8 billion in 2014. Last, Congress required the CFTC to impose speculative position limits on all commodities in the futures and swaps markets. It did so to reinforce the ability of hedgers like me to effectively manage commodity price risks. Despite having missed the deadline set by Congress, the Commission has continued to work on a final position limits rule. However, there has been talk of ceding the CFTC's authority to set position limits and to define hedge exemptions to the exchanges. NEFI and PMAA oppose this proposal. The exchanges are publicly traded entities that have a profit motive favoring higher traded volumes and a larger number of market participants. As such, they would have a bias towards higher limits and broader exemptions. We hope the committee will once again include language to enhance protections and regulatory relief for end users. During the MF global crisis, for example, several of my peers became victims when their accounts were frozen. It is important that Congress expand and protect companies like these. We also applaud you for reinforcing the need to keep small hedges from being caught in the net by regulations meant for larger market participants. The committee should also take a zero-tolerance approach to fraud and manipulation. Current civil penalties are inadequate to deter such actions, especially when compared to the overall profits of large market participants who view them simply as the cost of doing business. Congress should increase these penalties. As we move forward in the process, we caution you against inadvertently creating new loopholes that might benefit financial institutions and other large market participants. These include overly broad exemptions meant only for bona fide hedges. We oppose congressional intervention in the CFTC negotiations with its overseas counterparts regarding the harmonization of cross-border regulation of derivatives. Large traders should not be allowed to evade U.S. oversight by trading through offshore affiliates. We also caution against dramatically expanding the CFTC's cost-benefit requirements. This will result in more litigation, not less, and delay important new rules meant to protect small hedges. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. I know my time is up, but I may ask that the following groups be added to the record as endorsing my testimony: the Americans for Financial Reform, the American Feed Association, the Industrial Energy Consumers of America, the Gasoline and Automotive Service Dealers, and on position limits, the Trucking and Airline Association. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. And without objection, we'll be happy to add that to your written testimony for you as you requested. They haven't called votes yet, so we're going to go ahead with the questions, and we'll yield myself 5 minutes. And as many of you outlined in your testimony, the real costs that are being incurred by end users in complying with the Dodd-Frank Act rules. Can you be more specific with the sort of measures that you and your organizations have had to undertake to address the new rules, and whether or not you think that the cost and benefit is reasonable?
I'll take a start at that. I think when you talk about costs for regulations, there's really 2 elements of costs. One is the direct cost of compliance, and in our case, as a cash user, one of those is technology and resources to capture and retain records to meet reporting requirements. That's a fixed and known cost. The cost that's less quantifiable is the secondary cost of the cost of risk throughout the system. And if we don't have access to the current commercial risk management practices that we've utilized, costs go up and those get passed through the system. And in some cases, it could result even in loss of liquidity in markets and less price signal. So there's both a direct and an indirect cost to an environment of regulation around position limits particularly.
I would just build on that if I could.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The implicit and explicit costs are also very visible to pension plans as well as an end user. Similarly, in my testimony, I talked about costs being raised explicitly by over 20 times by an FCM that our pension plan faces. So we're starting to see the direct cost. The implicit cost is going back and revising investment management agreements, getting an internal and legal external counsel to sign off on revised documentation and new documentation for new specific terms that have never been in the marketplace before, as well as concepts in terms of representations that are needed from clients and new ways of trading. Swap execution facilities were not in existence before. So those are just a few of some of the direct and indirect costs. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Christie, if the CFTC significantly narrows the scope of bona fide hedging exemptions from position limits, would that impact your ability to serve cotton producers? And how would it impact commodity users generally?
Sure. I can give you a cotton example, and there are other examples as well. But in the cotton industry, it's very common for a commercial firm to make a commitment to buy all of the production that would come off of fixed acreage. That's particularly common in Texas. That production is highly variable based on weather. So a single weather event, a timely rain or an untimely hailstorm, could have a positive or negative impact on production. A commercial user like us needs to be able to reflect our real-time perceptions of that production and the obligation to buy that production by having active hedges. And a narrow definition of bona fide hedges, we would only be able to count as bona fide a hedge once a final volume was known, and that's really too late to pass the right price signals to producers. That's an example of a fixed commitment in the cotton business, but it could be an irrevocable bid or offer in a grain market. I'm sure there's examples in the energy markets as well where we have a clear risk obligation that we need to hedge with traditional mechanisms that we've used in the past.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Campbell, what would the consequences for energy markets be if the CFTC significantly lowered the swap dealer de minimis threshold from the current $8 billion to $3 billion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I brought it up in my testimony, and I think we have a case study that we saw with regard to special entities and the lower limit of the lower threshold that applied to them. And people made the conscious choice not to transact in swaps with these entities because they did not want to trigger the swap dealer threshold. These entities were dramatically impacted by that. They did not have a market that they usually relied on with entities like ours that were counterparties with them in the physical space were no longer willing to transact with them in the financial space to help them hedge. And they were left with basically essentially the large banks, the very large registered dealers to transact with. And ultimately they sought relief from the CFTC.
Thank you. I'm going to yield the remainder of my time back, and I'd like to recognize now my colleague, Congressman Scott from Georgia. And after his questions, we'll break for votes, and then we will come back as soon as the votes are over with.
Yes, let me ask you, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I'm very concerned about keeping the continuity of H.R. 4413. I think that's a path we need to keep on. And in our bill last year, we did something very important for you. We eased some reporting requirements for our end users. And I believe that it was critical that we do so in order to relieve some practices that were very burdensome on you all. So for each of you, could you tell me what were your record-keeping practices before Dodd-Frank and how have they changed since?
I can give a couple of examples. We always place a high premium on compliance, and we will keep the records that are required to meet those obligations. an example in our business as times have evolved, more and more of our business gets transacted or communicated via email, via text message, and not just on hardline phones that come into our office. So a requirement to keep records on cash transactions that may ultimately lead to a derivatives transaction, capturing all the methods and the modes in which that might come in has been a challenge. And our response to that has been to, in some ways, narrow the access or limit the kinds of transactions that we'll accept in order to be compliant with record-keeping requirements. And we think that's detrimental to the interest of the users that we're serving.
Yeah. One of the concerns I had was the unfortunate, I think, financial burden that some of this had on you. So give me an example. What are your monthly expenses associated with these record-keeping requirements?
I think that's a good question. I don't have access today to tell you what our monthly requirement or monthly cost would be, but that's certainly information that we could provide to you.
Would any of you have access to that? That would be very helpful in us keeping some of these regulatory burdens off of you. If we did have some actual factual implications of the degree of financial burden and how beneficial what we were doing were to you. Is there anyone? Yes, Mr. Murray.
I can speak for we're not an end user, but all of our customers are end users. But in terms of the monthly cost, we have to report all of our over-the-counter trades to the DTCC on a monthly basis, and annualized, it's, I want to say, right around $600,000, not including the programming, not including the staff, just the fees that we have to pay.
$600,000.
Yeah, that's not including the people, the programming, just the fees associated with reporting those trades.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Campbell.
Sure. The great example on the EEI side is physical options. I mean, these are physical products that were never considered swaps in the first place. So after Dodd-Frank, we were required to industry was required to treat these things and track these things and record these things as if they were swaps. Although the CFTC did provide some relief, we still had to set up new systems to identify these things as swaps, to track all exercises of these options. So even though there's relief from reporting to some degree, there are still additional systems and build out that needs to be done to meet the obligations even under the relief. EEI did a poll. I think in general most companies had to hire additional employees and staff to meet these obligations and develop systems. I know my company spent a significant amount of money developing systems to do all the new tracking that it had to do. And I believe EEI does have a number, and we can get that to you later on. But that's just one example. And to my point in my testimony, we still don't see the offsetting public benefit of regulating physical transactions like they are financial products.
So for all of you, what we did in H.R. 1443 is what we should continue to do in the new legislation. It was helpful to you in relieving some of that burden. Is that correct?
I would say absolutely yes.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Vote's been called. We should be back in approximately 30 minutes. I would just ask that we all return as quickly as possible. And this hearing will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair. All right, we'll call the meeting back to order. And Mr. Lamofo would be next. Mr. Lamofo, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Maurer, thanks for your patience in us doing our thing over there. Earlier in your testimony, you mentioned that with CFTC, the cross-border guidance proved to be much more complex than I think what we need. We're all concerned that some of these requirements impose a burden that is much greater than any possible benefit for U.S. markets. And so that the uncertainty remains over how to apply this directive in terms of the personnel that are overseas and the U.S. personnel of foreign entities in trading swaps. Your support for recognition of non-U.S. regulators' interest in regulating their own markets. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, please.
Sure thing. Thank you, Congressman. The issue I see there, I was in London last week, and we were sitting around a table and talking about how can we grow the business. And we have a significant amount of our customers that don't want to go through the rigmarole and the necessary paperwork and all of the regulations that come from Dodd-Frank. And we're trying to, and that's our issue to deal with. We recognize that, and we got to get those customers comfortable. But
so I want to be on the panel just with Mr. Scott before our break. You were talking about how that basically have people not willing to write certain types of swaps or deals, at least at a lower level, that there has to be a pretty high bar of value to make it worth the trouble. Does that kind of dovetail with that then?
Well, there has to be, a commercial reason why we do the business, for sure.
Yeah.
But
let's raise the bar to make it commercially viable, right? It has to be a bigger transaction to make it worth all the paperwork trouble. Yes.
Well, our business model is, no matter the size of the trade, we're wanting to help out the end user. But I see your point, and it's noted. But we have many customers that we do trades at a loss for, because we're here to help out the customer. So, but I understand your point there, and we're seeing even some of our competition also taking that may or may not be a swap dealer, but taking their business and those jobs and that staffing outside of the United States, so they do not have to deal with Dodd-Frank. And we obviously are not doing that. We're here. And if you look back, I would say a couple of years when Dodd-Frank was first being implemented, you saw a rather a noticeable decline in the amount of over-the-counter business. And what you're seeing now is we're seeing our domestic business starting to pick back up. And I believe that that's, partly cyclical, but also because our customers and, our end users, once again, the farmers of America are realizing there was a lot of value added when doing over-the-counter type hedging. And then they're coming back and they're saying, maybe the paperwork, yes, it's labor intensive, and yes, it's almost intimidating, but it's worth it to get the value-added services that we offer.
All right. Thank you. About out of time. Mr. Campbell, I appreciate your comments on how it applies to energy. Of course, we carried the bill my last term here on how municipal utilities were affected negatively by Dodd-Frank by having to be considered swap dealers at that low threshold. And so, of course, this shows that this changes can be made in Dodd-Frank, at least on a subtle level. We were successful in a bill getting it out of the House 423-0 that the CFTC later adopted those regs. And so I'm glad we can move the ball in that area here. So we as a committee certainly need to understand or know of certain areas we can tweak to continue to have more opportunities for swaps to be made and not have this regulatory burden just artificially stop them and chill the market. So with that, I'll turn back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you. One of the areas that I have been especially concerned about is, in order for everything that we actually have done to help you and to put into H.R. 4413 requires the CFTC to do an effective job. And so, as each of you are stakeholders in this, with the most direct exposure to how well the CFTC does its work, do you feel the CFTC is adequately funded? Yeah, any of you can answer that. I think it's good to get a feel from you. if you all think it's adequately funded or not.
Yeah, I think it's obviously difficult to set an absolute level of what funding should be, but one comment I would make on that is that historically, when we've looked at regulatory issues or position limits in particular, it's been more of a collaborative relationship between the CFTC, market participants, the exchanges, and even industry associations involved in that process. And I think that brought some efficiency and some clarity and to that process that a lot of record keeping maybe doesn't necessarily do as effective a job as having a more of a conversational approach. So I think to the extent that it's driven by record keeping and reporting, that may carry a cost burden that's higher than when it's more collaborative and more shared across all market participants.
Yeah, but are there any of you here that feel that it's not adequately funded and it needs to have effective funding to do the job that we're asking them to do? Yes, Ms. Kavanaugh.
Yes, I think it's critically important that as we're moving towards implementation, that we've shifted from regulation and rules being promulgated by the CFTC, and certainly the CFTC has made is a global leader in that construct in terms of tapping these markets when other regulators are not as far along in their rulemaking. As we shift towards that implementation, that's where some of these issues are vitally important in terms of getting it right. So it really reemphasizes the importance of the CFTC in that process.
So how important do you all think it would be for us to ask the CFTC, in other words, to allow for a delay in real-time swap reporting for non-financial end users whose swap activities can be identifiable in thinly traded markets in order to prevent them from being competitively disadvantaged by the financial players? How important is that? See, what I'm trying to get at here is the fact that while we have you here, I just think it's important because it's the CFTC that has to carry all of this out. And my concern is that I feel, quite honestly, that all that we're asking it to do, its workload has tripled. I mean, I just want to get a feel from those of you who are impacted by the work of the CFTC, if we're giving them enough funding, if they have enough staff. I think we have to look at that with a very serious jaundiced eye as we move forward, especially for you all. You're the ones that, not me, but you're the ones that sort of have to say, hey, they may need to pick the wicket up here or do what they should be doing in a better way.
I'll agree with what Mr. Christie said earlier. When you involve the end user and the market participants and get the voices of who the rules are actually affecting, it creates a more efficient environment and hopefully one where the CFTC can make do with their current budgeting. But I can't speak to the CFTC's budget, but I do agree with Mr. Christie.
Well, let me ask you this, and I'll be through on it. Are there any areas, in your opinion, that of the Commission's work that you feel need more support? Is there anything they're doing that affects you in which you think we need to address that they could do better? I mean, you got a chance here to say something about them, but
yes,
their feelings are not going to be hurt. It would help us to either continue to fight for them to get more or not. But if y'all are happy, then is there any area in which you feel they need more support or can do better? Yes, Ms. Senator.
What I think, again, when it comes back to the implementation of these particular regulations, the CFTC is critically important in terms of how we go forward and the intersection of so many rules, not just that the CFTC makes, but that has been emphasized in terms of cross-border. We need to keep liquid markets and those market participants active, and each one of us at this table actually represents a different end user. And I realize it's more of a philosophical statement, but I truly believe that we need to preserve, and the CFTC can help the liquidity of these marketplaces.
Okay, well, thank you, but I guess we could say all of you feel, in conclusion, that the CFTC is doing a good job and has sufficient funding. Is that the answer?
If I,
Pretty much.
I'll let
Thank you.
Mr. Maurer, you can answer, but then we're going to have to move to the next.
Okay. The CFTC could be doing a better job of getting the end user and getting the people that are affected by the rules into the rooms and to get those people more involved with the decisions and more involved with the rulemaking so we can make the whole process more efficient for everybody in the industry.
Well, thank you. That helps us a lot.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was nice somebody didn't care about hurting the CFTC's feelings today. So I appreciated your comments. The honesty and openness is really what we want, Mr. Maurer. And thank you for your comments on my colleague, Mr. Scott's question. I want to thank the chairman for calling this hearing today. It's important that we do hear from end users of derivatives because, as others on this committee have stated, we know that end users didn't cause the financial crisis. End users, including many agribusiness leaders in my home state of Illinois, they use derivatives to manage risks that are not central to their commercial activities, and yet they continue to deal with significant obstacles because of the CFTC regs that followed the passage of Dodd-Frank. So, again, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'd like to start my questions with Mr. Christie. Can you describe for the committee what type of financial resources it takes for an ag co-op or a warehouse to hedge its future purchase obligations in the futures market?
I can't comment on any specific firm what resources might be required, but to the extent that you've got a wide breadth of tools to use, including exchange-traded instruments or swaps, if that's appropriate for the particular instance, that minimizes the resource requirement and it allows for customization for a particular situation. So I think both of those things are important for minimizing costs. There obviously are capital requirements if you want to compete or participate in an over-the-counter exchange, and that varies based on the size of the business. So I couldn't comment on any individual, but I think having access to a wide breadth of tools minimizes the costs overall.
All right, well, thank you. And Mr. Maurer? At a hearing before the same committee in February, I expressed to Chairman Massad that concerns I have with the position limits rule. Specifically, I expressed my concern with the so-called conditional limit proposal, which would allow traders to hold positions in cash-settled contracts of up to 5 times the spot month limit, but only if they do not hold any positions in physical delivery contracts. Can you explain how the conditional limit proposal would impact your business and the derivatives market in general?
Thank you, Congressman. I would be happy to give you my opinions on those. Our firm specifically does very little business on the actual physical side and on the cash side. We're more financially based, at least the INTLFC Stone Markets subsidiary of the company. I can give you my opinion on 2 areas in position limits, if that would be okay.
That'd be great.
Okay. So I believe that the aggregation of position limits is one area that is affecting the company I work for, and there's, the parent company has, multiple different subsidiary companies. We're talking, merchants. I won't go through all the names, but they're all running separate individual businesses. And if you have a customer that needs to be long, let's say 100 corn swaps or 100 corn futures, in one of these 5 companies, subsidiaries, and then you have one in the other, and all of a sudden you're tying up the full limit at this point. As a company, we have to, at that point, pick which customer is more important or which business line is more important because they're seen in aggregate. So what I would propose is that each business unit have their own limit, and that's we're monitoring in that way now. It's just it's preventing some of our customers to being able to do all their hedging. And then the second hedging that's necessary. And then the second component would be the ability for the customers to, what is a hedge, and I think Mr. Christie spoke on that earlier. So I think that the definition of a bona fide hedge needs to be less complex and needs to be more broad and give our end users the ability to hedge their true needs. So.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. You mentioned the CFTC issues and what you thought they could do to possibly improve some of their interaction with end users. I want to ask you a question about if there's a disagreement with the CFTC. Are there any recommendations that you would have for this committee for the administrative hearings process or the adjudication process or the conflict resolution process over a decision that the CFTC has? I've had different interactions about some frustrations that many end users have with the CFTC in trying to resolve a problem. So can you give me your opinion on what they could do better?
Well, I think you just hit it on the head there. I think that when we have those interactions with the CFTC and when you are seeing a disagreement, the end user needs to have a voice. And having panels like this gives them a voice, and there needs to be other avenues as well where we can, reach out to our representatives and make sure they're aware of the issues.
Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.
Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to, forgive me, Mr. Campbell, I'm going to start with you. I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson, because you're operating a business, and this is kind of a rhetorical question, but it applies to everybody, and hopefully it'll make sense when I lead into the next ones. Could you just explain briefly why regulatory certainty is so important from a business planning perspective?
For us, I'm a Main Street merchant, and my customers depend upon me in my hometown to deliver a commodity that is essential to their well-being. I deliver heating oil, and it is essential for them to. We just went through in Massachusetts, we're in the national news, some very cold weather, some adverse situations, and our customers have a basic understanding that these basic commodities of life are going to end up on their doorstep on a timely manner, and that they're going to be treated fairly and priced fairly so that we do not have wide swings in price. I'm an end user, and when I hedge, I have the expectation is that I do take final delivery, and I can't. They're very seldom, except in a few options areas. But in most cases, my hedging is entirely with physical delivery. So for me, price discovery and transparency of the transaction is paramount. And since Dodd-Frank and Title VII has come through, is that we have seen there's been more transparency in the aggregate and more price discovery that makes me more comfortable with how I make presentations to my customers who I see every day on Main Street. I can't speak to some of the internal rules and regulations because most of my trading goes through a swap dealer, so they deal with the staff in Wall Street. But I look to take physical delivery.
Fair enough. And maybe it was inappropriate to pick on the business guy that's delivering the heating oil, because where I was going is certainty is what the issue is for most businesses. You can adjust, but you need to be able to plan for the future, and these sudden changes make it very difficult. Mr. Christie, I'm going to ask you, has the CFTC's approach to rulemaking and the resulting rules caused you to restructure, reduce hedging, change your means of hedging, or trade less efficiently? And if it has, and I can ask this of Mr. Campbell and Ms. Cavallari as well, but if it has, can you explain how?
So I think in the case of 1.35, we have made changes in our organization to limit the points and means of contacts that we have with the market in order to meet record-keeping requirements on cash transactions that may lead to a derivatives transaction. Our greater concern, I think, would be if if CFTC were to go ahead with a narrow definition of bona fide hedges, that would have a very broad and very widespread impact on our commercial activities. And that would be of significantly greater scale than the changes that we've had to make so far around Rule 1.35.
Well, that's actually a question for that I was going to say, but I can see I'm going to run out of time. Ms. Cavallari, Mr. Campbell, if you want to add to Mr. Christie's comments, that would be great. But if you could all just address in the time I have left on this definition of a bona fide hedge. Do you think Congress needs to be more explicit in defining what that is?
I think there is a definition in the Commodity Exchange Act that's pretty good. I think the issue that we are most concerned about from the end user side is the CFTC narrowing that definition even further and really kind of picking away at practices that we've engaged in, sound risk management practices for years. So it's really more of a narrowing of the definition that Congress provides as opposed to the definition itself.
So it might be helpful if the definition, if Congress would be more explicit with the definition so that it isn't narrowed?
Yes.
All right. And then I don't know if you had anything more to add on the whether or not these other things have affected your ability to hedge and you've had to restructure.
We've had to more closely examine the costs and what they are for the end user in terms of the opportunity, whether we're looking at futures, cleared swaps, or bilateral swaps. So that component, the indirect cost, if you will, of regulation, has trickled down specifically into costs for the end user. So because of that, we're more closely examining what specific instruments are appropriate for a pension plan to use.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. I yield back.
Mr. Nagelbauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing, and I apologize. Some of these questions may have been already asked, but I didn't get to hear the answer. So, but Mr. Christie, the Commission closed out its comments on the proposed position limits. And when I was back home last week, I heard from the cotton industry, specifically from the various co-ops on, the concern about being able to market and hedge the cotton for the producers as those producers put that cotton in the cooperatives. And the issue, of course, becomes around the bona fide hedge. Can you kind of describe the problems that could potentially create for those cooperatives and how that might impact the person I'm most concerned about is that producer that's put his cotton with the cooperative and hoping that they're going to be able to use all the tools to get him the best return on his cotton that they can.
Thank you for the question, and your district is an important one for us. We buy a lot of cotton out of that area, so I'm happy to answer that question. I think, particularly in the case of West Texas, it's a dryland cotton production. It's very dependent on weather, and that can include favorable or unfavorable weather events. And in the case of a co-op, members are typically putting all of their production into that co-op. So it's important that the managers of that organization can consistently reflect their real-time view of how much production is going to be coming at them and be able to actively hedge that. If we had a very narrow definition of bona fide hedges where a fixed price needed to be attached to that cotton or a fixed volume, that would limit the ability to make anticipatory hedges on that obligation. So I think it's a very real concern that market participant have the ability to anticipate production and make hedges accordingly.
And are you concerned that the Commission's current position on that, or where you think they're headed, is going to be problematic for those cooperatives?
I think the risk or the concern would be that conditions change very dynamically, and so to have a single definition or a single line around what constitutes a bona fide hedge, I think can be challenging because associated risk with that, it could be price risk, it could be delivery risk on forward commitments. There's a lot of things that could enter into the risk picture, and so I think letting people make economically appropriate hedges that mitigate risk, I think it's important that they have that degree of freedom to do that.
Here's just a general question, because one of the concerns I have about when we start down the road of position limits and so forth is making sure that we have an appropriate amount of liquidity in the marketplace. And when you start beginning to say you can play and you can't play, then I worry about that. Just in a general, Mr. Campbell, would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah, and thank you. And because loss of liquidity in the markets not only impacts your ability to access markets to hedge, but there's a lot of value in the futures markets for transparency. We use the futures markets for the price signal we get to price the contracts we enter into in the physical space. So if you have less liquidity and wider bid-ask spreads, it gets really difficult to price contracts in the physical space. So it can certainly impact all aspects of our business, not just our ability to hedge.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Calvary.
Again, I couldn't agree more with Mr. Campbell. It's important. Part of liquidity is also the diversity of the market participants. And having that diversity of market participants, it's just crucial that that be preserved because that just only contributes to the overall efficiency of these markets.
Anybody? I think that one of the questions I'd have, just in the remaining, are there safeguards already in place that would, I think what people want to make sure position limits is somehow somebody is, manipulating the price by the number of positions they have. Do you feel like that there are already within the system protections and we don't need to tighten those rules up? It's a question.
I'll go out on a limb here and try to answer it. I think everybody supports the ability to hedge. I think most people recognize the value of speculators into providing liquidities and providing counterparties for those looking to hedge. I don't think anybody to date has actually identified what an excessive speculator looks like. So I'll leave it at that. I think liquidity is vital to the entire financial system, the entire energy and commodity markets.
Well, we need people on both sides of the transaction or there is no marketplace.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. I've got one last question, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Scott if he has any closing comments, and then we'll adjourn. But this deals with the record keeping, and Mr. Christie, the expanded record keeping requirements enacted by the CFTC, were they called for in the Dodd-Frank Act, and is the Commission's proposed relief adequate for you and for your customers on the record keeping?
Being several years down the road, it's probably difficult to form an opinion on what was initially envisioned. I do think that to the extent that cash transactions and cash discussions are subject to the same record-keeping requirements as futures transactions or swap transactions, I think that's a broader universe than what maybe was initially envisioned. So while there's clearly a connection between cash transactions and eventually derivative transactions, I think having comparable recording requirements is a pretty broad application.
All right. Mr. Scott, before we adjourn, I just want to recognize you for any closing statements that you may have.
Sure. First of all, this has been a very, very informative hearing. Before us is an opportunity to reintroduce some much-needed legislation, and we're going to basically mirror this legislation after the one we did last year, 4413, that would give some clarity. That would also mainly make sure our end users in the commodities and agriculture, energy, those that are not financial entities are not dealt with the same way because it's not fair to you. I'm also very concerned, as I mentioned in my statement, that we make sure, and I hope that as you move forward, it's very important that the CFTC have the financial resources to do this job. If it doesn't have those financial resources, their workload is tripled as a result of the meltdown. Burnout rate has been tremendous. It's a new commission. They're the ones that have to carry this bowl to make sure we have smooth sailing in dealing with the swaps market and the derivatives. It's a very complicated, complex area. is now nearly $900 trillion of the world's economy. And we are the biggest player in that economy. And we want to maintain that as we move with things like cross-border, push-out, all of that affects end users, to not be categorized in there, where you have to be pushed out of one bank, where you need to be in there, where you can do your hedging with especially interest rate swaps, which is the pivot swap to hedge yourself. So this is a very complex, complicated area we're dealing with, and we want to make sure, and we will, that we get some good legislation that's bipartisan, that reflects your concerns. And again, we want to make sure, I'm very worried about, as you can imagine from my comments, that we make sure that we give the CFTC the resources that are needed, because if they don't, it's going to back up and be more detrimental to you. So, Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure working with you. This is our first hearing together.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
And I too am committed to a piece of legislation that will increase access and integrity in the markets. I think that's key for all of us, and I want to thank you for coming and testifying today. These are complex issues, and we need to hear from those of you who deal with them on a daily basis. So thank you all for coming. And under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any questions proposed by a member. The Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy and Credit hearing is now adjourned.
Good job, Mr. Chairman.